Bumpy Johnson, a name people in Harlem said quieter than a whisper. His life became so tangled in stories and legends that sometimes it's hard to tell where the facts end and the myth begins. He was one of the most influential figures in Harlem's history. Not just a street boss, but a man who built a system, connections, money, rules, and forced even those who believed Harlem could only be controlled by force to reckon with it. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a protector of the neighborhood. But to everyone, he was a man who changed the balance of power. His story isn't about one night or one shot. It's a constant fight for power, for order, and for the right to set the terms in a place where you were never supposed to have that right. Today, I'm going to tell one of the darkest and most revealing stories about Bumpy, one that was supposed to end on a rooftop, but was really just the beginning. Chapter 1. The Roof That Didn't Need. Witnesses. Harlem knew the difference between noise and danger. Noise was the street, arguments over dice, a jukebox turned too loud, a drunk knocking over a chair and calling it a war. Danger was quieter. Danger wore clean shoes and didn't look around when it walked into a room. In the early 1950s, the quiet kind started showing up more often. It didn't begin with guns. It began with paper. A bar owner got a visit from a man who wasn't a cop but spoke like one. A numbers runner got stopped twice in the same week for the same random reason. A landlord who never cared about anything suddenly cared about permits, inspections, and signatures. Little delays, little problems, small hands pulling at a big machine. And when Harlem's machine slowed down, other people smelled opportunity. They came from the west side with a story they wanted the city to believe. Not a feud, not an invasion, an accident, a tragedy, a man who got careless. 4 men, not a crew. 4 men because too many creates talk. Too many creates witnesses. 4 is just enough to hold a door, just enough to move fast, just enough to disappear back into the dark, like they were never there. They weren't looking to own Harlem, not directly. They were hired to remove a name from the board long enough for someone else to rewrite the rules. And the name they wanted gone was Bumpy Johnson. That week, Bumpy kept his schedule the way he always did, like a man who didn't owe fear any rent. He shook hands, answered questions, listened more than he spoke. People mistook his calm for comfort. The truth was simpler. Bumpy had seen men rush into traps their whole lives. He'd learned to move like time was watching. But even a careful man has to step into the open sometimes. A message reached him through the kind of channel that felt safe. Familiar voice, familiar face, a meeting that sounded routine. Someone wanted to clear up confusion. Someone wanted to keep police attention off the block. Someone wanted to talk like adults. That's how you get a man to an empty building without dragging him. By making him think it was his idea to show up. The building was old and forgettable, the kind that blended into the neighborhood like it had been tired for decades. The stairwell smelled like dust and cold stone. The lights didn't fully commit to working. The 4 men were already there, spread out with the patience of people who'd practiced being nothing. When Bumpy stepped inside, he understood it fast, not with panic, not with surprise, with clarity, like someone reading the last line of a letter they already suspected was bad news. One of them spoke first. Not loud, not dramatic. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Bumpy looked at him the way a judge looks at a man trying to bargain with the weather. No, Bumpy said. You are. They didn't argue. That wasn't why they came. They guided him upward, one flight at a time, not rushing, not giving the building a reason to remember their footsteps. The city noises got thinner the higher they climbed, replaced by wind and the low, distant rhythm of traffic. The roof door opened with a reluctant scrape, and the night air hit like a slap of honesty. Up there, Harlem looked like it always did from above. Lights scattered like coins nobody could quite pick up. A few blocks away, music leaked out of a window and turned into nothing in the wind. On the roof, there were no crowds, no corners to duck behind, no friendly faces, just space. That was the point. The four men positioned themselves like they'd done it before. Not in a circle, not theatrical, just practical. Too close, too farther back, all of them watching Bumpy's hands like hands were the only truth. You understand what this is, the closest one said. Bumpy didn't plead. He didn't negotiate. He didn't try to buy his way out with words that would have sounded cheap in the cold air. He asked a question instead, calm, almost curious. Who told you this ends anything? The man didn't answer. He didn't have to. Men like that never worked for themselves. They worked for pressure, for promises, for someone else's idea of order. Bumpy took one slow step, not forward, sideways, toward a patch of roof where gravel had gathered in a shallow line, like the building itself had been marking boundaries. He was reading the scene, distance to the door, distance to the edge, the way the wind leaned, the way one of them kept glancing down the street, as if afraid of being late to his own disappearance. They were waiting for one clean moment, not a spectacle, a fall that could be sold as fate. The closest man moved first, small motion, quick hands, no speech. The others tightened around the space like the night had taught them how. And then the roof did what roofs do. It gave you an edge, it gave you gravity, it gave you a story the city would repeat without checking the details. Bumpy went over. There was no scream that echoed for blocks. No dramatic pause, just the sudden absence of a man from the roof line and four figures standing in the wind, looking down, long enough to convince themselves it was done. They didn't stay. They left the way they came, quiet, controlled, already rehearsing the version of events they'd tell if anyone ever asked. By the time they reached the street, Harlem was still alive, still arguing, still laughing in pockets, still moving like nothing had changed. That was the second point. A neighborhood doesn't stop for one moment, it only shifts, and shifts are where power gets stolen. Before midnight, the rumor started exactly where it was supposed to start, through the right mouths, into the right ears, carried by people who sounded concerned and just curious enough to feel believable. You could hear it in barber shops, in hallways, on stoops where men pretended they weren't listening. Bumpy Johnson is gone. Not shot, not killed, gone. A word that leaves room for fear to decorate the rest. And somewhere in the city, the people who paid for this checked their watches and smiled, not because they enjoyed chaos, but because they understood something simple. If you can take the king off the board for even a few days, pawns start believing they can choose their own direction. Harlem went quiet in a way outsiders didn't understand. No speeches, no retaliation, no sudden parade of anger, just doors closing a little earlier, just faces watching a little longer, just the feeling that the neighborhood was holding its breath, like a boxer who isn't hurt yet, but is deciding when to start swinging. because Harlem wasn't asking, did it happen? Harlem was asking, who moved first? And in a small room somewhere off Lenox, behind a curtain that didn't look like much, a man lay out of sight while the city told the wrong story on purpose. Not dead, not defeated, just unavailable. Long enough to make the next move count. Chapter 2. The Man. Harlem didn't confirm. In Harlem, confirmation was currency. If a name carried weight, people didn't rush to spend it. They held it. They tested it. They watched what happened when it floated through a room. Who looked away? Who leaned in? Who suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be? That night, the rumor moved fast because it was designed to move fast. It slid through barber shops and back rooms, from payphones to kitchen tables, from men who just heard something to women who didn't ask twice. Bumpy Johnson is gone. And then Harlem did something that made outsiders nervous. It didn't react. No sirens chasing the story. No loud mourning. No public rage. The streets kept their rhythm, cars rolling, storefronts opening, church steps filling and emptying. But under the normal, a different system clicked on. A system built on questions. Who started the rumor? Who benefited from it? Who looked too relieved? Men who worked corners noticed unfamiliar faces, standing still too long. Numbers runners got told to take different routes without being told why. Bar owners stopped extending credit to people they couldn't read in one glance. There were no announcements, just adjustments. Because Harlem wasn't leaderless. It was leader-hidden. Bumpy wasn't in a hospital bed with a nurse writing his name on a chart. A hospital meant forms, and forms meant leaks. And leaks meant someone showing up with sympathy and leaving with information. So Bumpy's people put him somewhere smaller. A room that didn't sound like anything from the street. A place that didn't invite questions. A place where the neighbors were used to minding their own business, because minding your own business was how you stayed living next to the wrong kind of trouble. The man watching the door wasn't a soldier with an attitude. He was older, patient. The kind of man who had seen panic ruin good plans, and had trained himself not to panic at all. Inside, Bumpy didn't talk much. He listened. He let the city speak to him through fragments, names dropped in whispers, shifts in routine, silence where noise used to be. He didn't need a map. Harlem itself was the map. The only thing that changed was who thought they could draw on it. The first report came in before sunrise. A collector had been approached, politely, by someone offering protection at a discount. Not a threat. An offer. The second report was more specific. A man from the West Side had been seen meeting with someone who didn't belong to the West Side at all. Not street muscle, a suit, a car that stayed clean, a driver who kept the engine running. By noon, Bumpy had enough to say a sentence that felt like a verdict. "This isn't about pride," he said. "This is about the book." In Harlem, the book meant more than money. It meant records. It meant who owed what, who got paid when, who stayed calm under pressure. If someone could tilt the numbers, could interrupt collections for even a week, they could make people desperate. Desperate people make fast choices. Fast choices create new loyalties. And that was the real attack, not the roof. The time after the roof. So Bumpy did the thing most men couldn't do after being thrown into the dark. He stayed out of sight on purpose. He didn't rush to prove he was alive. He didn't send a message to calm the block. He let the rumor breathe, because the rumor was doing work for him now. It was revealing people. A captain reveals himself in a storm, not in a parade. That afternoon, 2 men came to one of Bumpy's trusted operators with the same question, phrased 2 different ways. Who's in charge now? That question was a test, a trap with manners. The operator didn't answer it the way they expected. He didn't claim control. He didn't posture. He said, "Harlem is." It sounded like nothing, but it was everything. Because if no one could point to a new boss, then the outsiders couldn't pick a target. If there was no visible succession, there was no visible fracture. And without a fracture, you couldn't slide a blade in. Bumpy's people moved like clerks, not killers. They didn't gather in big groups. They didn't have meetings with 10 chairs. They spoke in 2s and 3s, in passing like coincidence. Instructions went out disguised as favors. Don't use that phone again. Change the drop. Pay him early. Make him comfortable. Let them think it's easy. And the most important instruction of all, no one says his name. Not in anger. Not in grief. Not in reassurance. The city could whisper it. Strangers could repeat it. But the people who mattered wouldn't confirm it. Because confirmation would end the rumor. And the rumor, for now, was bait. Meanwhile, the 4 men from the roof were doing exactly what Bumpy expected men like them to do after a job they thought was clean. They started counting their reward before it arrived. One of them got loud in a bar 2 blocks too close to the neighborhood he wasn't supposed to be in. Another made a call from a payphone that he used twice. Same corner, same hour, same habit. Habits were fingerprints. Bumpy didn't need their faces. He needed their routines. On the second night, a visitor arrived at the safe room. Not a friend. Not an enemy. A man with careful eyes and expensive silence. The kind of silence that came from living around important people. He didn't sit until he was invited. "They're saying you're dead," the man said. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment, like he was reading the stitching on his suit. "And what are you saying?" Bumpy asked. The man paused. "I'm saying it would be convenient, for some." Bumpy nodded once, small. "Convenient is never free," he said. The visitor swallowed, as if he'd expected bravado, and got math instead. "There's talk," the man continued, "that the West Side boys didn't do this on their own." Bumpy's gaze didn't change, but the room did. The air got tighter, not from fear, but from focus. "Who's paying?" Bumpy asked. The man named a broker, not a gangster, a go-between. Someone who could walk into a bank and also walk into a back room. Someone who didn't fight wars. He financed them. Bumpy closed his eyes for a second, not tired, just filing the name where it belonged. Then he opened them and said the first thing that sounded like a plan. "Good," he said. "That means this ends when I decide it ends." He shifted slightly, careful, controlled. "Bring me a list," he told the man at the door. "Not of who's brave, of who's hungry." Because hunger was predictable, and predictable men were movable. By the 3rd day, the rumor had grown teeth. People weren't just saying Bumpy was gone, they were acting like the space he left was empty. Small operators started taking bigger risks. A couple of West Side faces began showing up with new confidence. Money started hesitating, pausing in hands that didn't want to be the last loyal man holding the bag. That's when Bumpy smiled for the first time. Not because he enjoyed any of it. Because the board was finally lit up. They had stepped into Harlem thinking it was a street fight. But Harlem was a switchboard. And Bumpy Johnson, alive and unconfirmed, was the operator. On the fourth night, he spoke to his closest people for less than a minute. No speech, no oath, no drama, just a schedule. Tomorrow, he said, they lose the ability to coordinate. He didn't say how. He didn't need to. Because Harlem didn't need a war. It needed 90 minutes of confusion. And confusion, when it's engineered, feels like fate. Chapter 3. 90 minutes of no orders power didn't disappear in Harlem. It changed hands the way a pocket watch changes pockets, quietly, smoothly, and usually before the last man realized it was missing. On the fifth day, the West Side felt good. Not safe, not settled, but good enough to start believing their own story. Bumpy Johnson was gone. The rumor had lasted. The streets hadn't erupted. No one had stepped up loud enough to replace him. From the outside, it looked like Harlem was holding a funeral with the curtains closed. And when men see curtains closed, they assume the house is empty. That morning, the four who'd taken him to the roof made their mistake. They started planning, like they had time. They picked meeting spots. They assigned errands. They spoke on phones as if phones were private. They leaned on the same go-betweens, the same cars, the same comfortable habits. They behaved like winners. Bumpy behaved like a man who'd already counted how many moves a winner could make before he ran out of board. He didn't want revenge that made headlines. He didn't want a street war that brought uniforms and cameras. He wanted something colder and more permanent. He wanted the West Side's structure to collapse. And to do that, you didn't need to hit everybody. You needed to hit what everybody relied on. At 6:10 p.m., the first switch flipped. A messenger who always delivered instructions for the West Side didn't show. He didn't get grabbed. He didn't get chased. He simply decided, without explanation, that tonight wasn't his night to be loyal. He turned his pockets inside out in front of the right man and said, "I don't want this trouble." At 6:23 p.m., the second switch flipped. A car that was supposed to take two of the four to a meet was suddenly in the shop. That was the phrase. That was the excuse. Nobody argued because everybody had somewhere else to be. Except they didn't. At 6:41 p.m., the third switch flipped. A payoff that was meant to calm a nervous partner didn't arrive. Not because it was stolen, because the hands that usually moved it didn't move it. Money is loud when it lands. It was silent. And silence makes men check their doors. By 7 o'clock, the four were doing what Bumpy wanted them doing. They were calling each other. Over and over, quick calls, sharp calls, angry calls. Calls that revealed where they were, what they expected, what they feared. Calls that created a map. In the safe room, Bumpy listened to the map being drawn in real time. He didn't speak much. He didn't have to. His people were already in motion, not in a line, not as a mob, but as small, precise pieces sliding into place. This wasn't a fight. It was a power outage. At 7:12, one of the four arrived at a bar that had agreed to host a business talk. He walked in expecting familiarity. He got polite emptiness, faces that looked through him, not at him. The owner spoke softly like he didn't want the words to stay in the air. "Kitchen's closed," the owner said. "Come back tomorrow." The man didn't understand at first. Then he understood too quickly. Because the owner didn't look afraid. He looked decided. At 7:29, another one of the four reached for an ally and found an excuse instead. A man who used to answer on the first ring let the phone ring and ring until it became embarrassing. When he finally picked up, his voice was careful, like he was holding something fragile. "I can't," he said. Not tonight. Can't what? The West Side man snapped. I can't be seen, the ally replied, and hung up. At 7:45, Bumpy made the only call he needed to make. It wasn't to threaten anyone. Threats were common. Threats made men feel important. This call was different. It was informational. He reached a broker's private line, the kind of number you didn't dial unless you were sure the person on the other end had something to lose. When the broker answered, his voice had the tone of a man pretending not to recognize a storm. Yes? Bumpy spoke like he was reading a receipt. You financed a rumor, Bumpy said, and you paid 4 men for a roof. A pause. The broker tried to sound bored. I don't know what you're talking about. Bumpy didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. You will, Bumpy said. In about an hour. Another pause. Longer. What do you want? The broker asked. Bumpy's answer was calm enough to be terrifying. I want you to stop buying my neighborhood, he said. And I want you to understand you won't get a second chance to misunderstand me. He didn't demand money. He didn't demand apologies. He demanded behavior. Then he hung up. At 8:05, the 4 men finally did what they should have done earlier. They tried to regroup. They chose a place they thought was neutral, an intersection where they assumed nobody owned the sidewalk. But Harlem owned the sidewalk the way the ocean owns a shoreline, not by claiming it, by shaping it. 2 of them arrived. 1 didn't. The last one was late, and in that gap, those minutes where men stand around pretending they aren't worried, Bumpy's plan did its real work. It separated them. Because separation is where confidence dies. By 8:40, the West Side stopped acting like a team and started acting like individuals. Each man trying to save his own future, each man wondering if the others were already selling him, each man realizing that the roof job wasn't a victory, it was a signal that they'd been used, and now the user was stepping away. At 8:57, Bumpy stood up for the first time that night. The room watched him like the room had been waiting for gravity to return. He put on his coat slowly, not as a performance, as a reminder that he didn't need speed to win. One of his men said, You want to be seen? Bumpy shook his head. No, he said. I want them to know. Outside, Harlem was still Harlem. Streetlights buzzing, radios murmuring behind windows. People living their lives with the instinctive understanding that tonight was not for curiosity. Bumpy didn't walk onto a corner and announce himself. He did something better. He let the neighborhood announce him. A word passed through the right channels. Quiet, controlled, undeniable. The kind of message you only hear if you're connected, and the kind you can't ignore once you do. He's back. Not shouted. Confirmed. And when that confirmation landed, it landed on top of everything else. The missed meat, the dead phones, the unreturned favors, the money that didn't move, the partners who suddenly grew consciences. The West Side didn't lose because Harlem hit harder. They lost because Harlem moved together. Because in 90 minutes, they went from believing they were the future to realizing they couldn't even give an order that would be obeyed. Later, people would tell it the way people always tell it. Cleaner, sharper, with the parts that sounded like legend and the parts that sounded like warning. They'd talk about a roof. They'd talk about 4 men. They'd talk about how the city tried to erase a name and ended up underlining it. But the truth, the real truth that made Harlem dangerous, was simpler than the story. Bumpy Johnson didn't return with a war. he returned with coordination. And in Harlem, coordination was the most violent thing you could do without throwing a punch.